Okay, so we'll get started. Hi everybody, welcome. My name is Emily Keene. I'm the Associate Director of the Academic Program at the Human Rights Program here at Harvard Law School. Welcome. Just before we get started, I want to thank our co-sponsors for today's event, which includes the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law and Policy, the Center for Health Law and Policy Innovation, as well as the Criminal Justice Policy Program here at HLS. Today's event is also funded by the Wellspring Advisors, so we extend our gratitude to them as well. So, contact with the criminal justice system and legal and social processes of criminalization impact the enjoyment of a range of human rights, as well as produce stigmatization and discrimination, which can cause poor health outcomes. This process is acutely experienced by people who are already marginalized in our society. Our event today is part of a year-long speaker series that takes a deep dive into this theme, as it intersects in particular with the criminal regulation of sexuality, gender, and reproduction. It's also part of the Human Rights Program's programming focused on human rights concerns within the U.S., as today's speaker will be talking about the criminalization of HIV and other diseases here in our country. So today's speaker is Trevor Hoppe, who is an assistant professor of sociology at the State University of New York in Albany. He joined Albany after a postdoctoral fellowship in criminology law and at the Criminology Law and Society Department at the University of California at Irvine. His research examines how punishment came to be a legitimate response to controlling HIV and disease more generally. He's published 2 books, which came out last year. The first, The War on Sex, is a collection of essays co-edited with David Halperin analyzing the criminalization of sex. The second book, Punishing Disease, is a monograph explaining the rise of punitive responses to HIV and other infectious diseases. Here, we don't have copies for you to buy, but I encourage you to go read both of them. They're really fantastic. And so we're very lucky to have him here. This is his first in-depth book talk for this book, so we're very lucky. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Emily, and thanks everyone at the Human Rights Program and the other co-sponsors for inviting me here today. I'm really honored and excited to see so many faces in the room. I'm going to be talking about HIV, and if there's any acronym or at some point I say something that doesn't quite jive, sometimes, law, sociology, we speak different languages. Feel free to just pop in and say, what do you mean by that? So before I get started, just to get a sense of the room, how many people before hearing about this talk knew that there were HIV-specific criminal laws? Period. Okay, so maybe a third to half. All right, I think that's helpful to sort of know. Hopefully when you leave today, you'll have a better sense of what the laws are and what the kind of implications are for human rights, social justice, and sexuality. From the very beginning of the epidemic, AIDS was linked to punishment. In the 1980s and early 1990s, America was in the grips of an AIDS panic. A new disease was killing and maiming hundreds at first, then tens of thousands. For several years, the cause remained a medical mystery. AIDS was originally given the unfortunate moniker GRID, or gay-related immunodeficiency, as it was decimating urban gay enclaves. The newly ascendant evangelical conservative right seized on this trend, declaring AIDS to be, quote, a cure for homosexuality. For the so-called moral majority, AIDS was divine retribution for moral decay. The reactionary response to AIDS immediately sparked debates about health privacy that frequently pitted the interests of people living with HIV on the one hand against the interests of the broader public on the other. Many public health and legal experts wondered, for example, whether quarantine laws ought to be extended to give health officials more power to detain people living with the disease that they labeled as, quote, recalcitrant. Conservative columnists, some of us may be old enough to remember, went even further. William F. Buckley, for example, explicitly argued for that everyone diagnosed with HIV be tattooed to warn their partners of their infection. AIDS activists fiercely resisted these policies as draconian efforts to trample on civil liberties, policies that they argued were stigmatizing and thus likely to be counterproductive in the fight against AIDS. Activists argued that freedom and privacy, not coercion and intrusive surveillance, were the keys to a successful disease control strategy. Despite their efforts, in the late 1980s, state lawmakers around the country began to introduce criminal laws targeting people living with HIV whom they viewed as recklessly exposing their sexual partners to the disease. Although these laws are sometimes mislabeled as HIV transmission laws, most criminal statutes enacted in the US governing HIV make no mention of transmission, or even the risk of that outcome. Instead, these new offenses resemble what prosecutors might call a crime of omission. By failing to reveal their HIV status to their partners, HIV-positive people in dozens of states can now face stiff prison penalties if charged under these felony laws. Now, before I turn to my research on these laws, I think it's important to just get some basic facts. I don't know where we all had sex education, but just to get some refresher course, a crash course here in HIV, because I know sometimes it's very foreign for some of us. So let's imagine a scenario for a second, where an HIV-positive woman has condomless sex one time with an HIV-negative man. All right, so HIV-positive woman, HIV-negative man, they have vaginal intercourse one time. What do we think the odds of transmission are in that scenario? So who thinks the odds are close to 100%? No votes for 100%. What about 50%? Half. 25%? Maybe. Some more hands. 10%. And 1% or less. Yeah. Okay. So some variation. When I do this for my students, most of them raise their hand around 100%. The answer is much less, in fact, than 1%. It's about 1 in 2,000 to be precise. And that data comes from the early 1990s, before HIV treatment was introduced, that in 1996, that radically transformed HIV medicine. When you first contract HIV, and you'll see this is relevant to our discussion today later on, the virus reproduces in your body nonstop. You can have up to 1 million copies of HIV circulating in every milliliter of blood in those early stages of infection. Before 1996, there really wasn't much they could do for people diagnosed as HIV positive. But scientists developed effective treatment in 1996 that revolutionized HIV. Overnight, the disease went from a largely terminal illness to a chronic, manageable disease. Today, people diagnosed as HIV positive can take a pill a day with very few side effects that allows them to live a full and complete and healthy life. But the impact of treatment went beyond dramatically improving the lives of people living with HIV. Scientists also discovered that it reduces and even eliminates the risk of transmission sexually. That's because it interrupts the life cycle of HIV, preventing it from reproducing to the point that current tests cannot detect the virus in your body. So that's what having an undetectable viral load means. It means literally if scientists go looking for the virus in your body, they cannot find it. Studies now show that people living with HIV who are on treatment and have achieved this undetectable viral load cannot transmit the disease. How do we know this? Just as sort of, this study was very important, so I like to talk about it. So social scientists followed over 1,000 couples, some gay, some straight, in which one person was HIV positive and one person was HIV negative. And in order to participate, you had to be having sex at least without condoms at least some of the time, right? And the HIV positive person had to have an undetectable viral load. After an estimated 58,000 condomless sexual encounters, how many transmissions did the scientists observe between partners? 0. Not a single transmission within couples after several years. And this science led HIV advocates to declare, quote, undetectable equals untransmittable. U equals U. You'll hear this very often now in HIV circles. So now that we've been brought up to speed in the latest in HIV science, I'll turn to the subject of my talk today. First, I'm going to speak about why we have HIV-specific criminal laws in the first place. Why did lawmakers feel it was necessary to develop new criminal statutes specific to a disease? Second, I'm going to talk about how these laws are actually being enforced in courtrooms across the US. Finally, I'm going to conclude by arguing that the criminal law is the wrong policy solution for controlling infectious disease and considering what the possible paths forward may be for American crime policy. So, by 1985, over 100,000 Americans had contracted HIV. Many of those had died, including the shocking death, some of you, again, may be old enough to remember, of America's one-time heartthrob actor Rock Hudson, sort of the Tom Cruise of his day. For several years, the Reagan administration had largely shrugged off news that Americans were dying by the thousands across the country of an unknown deadly disease. After all, those affected by AIDS belonged to what conservatives jokingly referred to as, quote, the 4-H club: homosexuals, hemophiliacs, Haitians, and heroin users, sometimes hookers. However, as more and more Americans died, the government's indifference became increasingly indefensible. For reasons I detail in the book, existing public health law was inadequate to respond to HIV. Lawmakers needed to draft new legislation tailored to this specific epidemic. So around the country, these debates were marked over these laws were marked by calls from social conservatives and evangelicals for invasive and punitive measures to curtail the rights of people living with HIV. HIV-positive kids were kicked out of their schools. People who died of HIV were rejected by funeral homes. The increasingly powerful new right capitalized on America's fears to promote punitive policies that explicitly and implicitly targeted gay men, sex workers, and injection drug users. This deeply punitive cultural context in which AIDS emerges serves as a foundation for the wave of criminal legislation introduced beginning in the 1980s that spread across the US. So in chapter 4 of the book, I analyzed the legislative debates associated with the 150 bills introduced between 1985 and 2014 in 45 states to explore how HIV became a crime. Historically, scholars have suggested that federal policies were responsible for prompting states to enact HIV-specific criminal legislation. Specifically, they point, it's mostly legal scholars, any law review editors here. If you know any law review editors, tell them if people make empirical claims about the social world, to have evidence to back it up. Cheers. Legal scholars repeatedly pointed to the Presidential Commission in 1988 and the Ryan-White Care Act of 1990 to say, well, those federal policies recommended criminalization, therefore that must be what caused states to lead to introduce this criminal legislation. But as I show in the book, this is not a federal story. The reasons lawmakers cite in introducing HIV-specific legislation are numerous, but are never centrally about responding to a mandate or a recommendation for the federal government. For the sake of time, I'm going to only briefly summarize my findings in this area, but I'm happy to talk in more detail in the Q&A. In short, I identify 3 forces that prompted lawmakers to pass criminal legislation targeting people living with HIV. First, prosecutors around the country, beginning in the early 1980s, as soon as AIDS emerges, faced a series of embarrassing setbacks early in the epidemic as they tried to punish people living with HIV under general statutes. Time and time again, a local prosecutor would attempt to bring felony assault with a deadly weapon charges or even attempted murder charges against HIV-positive defendants. With few exceptions, these efforts failed, either because they could not prove that the defendant acted with criminal intent, or in other cases because police had failed miserably to properly obtain protected medical records for the prosecution. These failures made headlines across the country in major newspapers and were a source of considerable embarrassment for prosecutors, and that translated into public calls for new disease-specific criminal laws, right? Because general statutes weren't working, there was a sense that we needed new laws. The second impetus that prompted lawmakers to turn to the new criminal law was police. During the early 1980s, there was considerable anxiety among public health professionals and the public that prostitution might provide a bridge for HIV to jump from urban centers, i.e. gay men, to American suburbs, i.e. wives of cheating white middle-class husbands and their unborn children. That's the sort of story, right? There was no evidence to support this theory. In fact, as one law scholar put it in the mid-1980s, quote, current statistics reveal that prostitutes are an unremarkable source of AIDS infection. Nonetheless, numerous news reports from the 1980s cite a sense of aggravation among law enforcement authorities confronted with sex workers who had tested positive for HIV. In short, because prostitution was a misdemeanor offense, there was little they could do to keep these women, and they're invariably women, behind bars for more than a couple days or a month at longest. And so this I talk about in the book as organized aggravation, the active lobbying of lawmakers done by police, specifically asking for felony HIV-specific criminal laws. In some states, such as Colorado, for example, mere days separated sensational police-driven media reports of a single arrest of a sex worker and the introduction of very broadly construed HIV-specific criminal legislation. The third factor identified in the book relates to sodomy laws, and a little Harvard-related story here. You may remember sodomy laws were on the books until quite recently, in fact, in many states around the country. In 1985, Georgia was preparing its defense of its sodomy law for the Supreme Court case Bowers v. Hardwick. Some legal observers wondered whether the AIDS epidemic might give Georgia a more rational scientific basis for punishing gay sex. Oral arguments in the case the next year primarily focused on whether American citizens had a right to engage in whatever forms of consensual sexual behaviors in private that they chose. But at the very end of the hour-long hearing, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor asked a question of the lawyer representing the Georgia man arrested under this state sodomy ban. You may recognize his name, Harvard Law professor Larry Tribe. Justice O'Connor asks Tribe, quote, "You suggested that if the state were to assert its desire to promote traditional families instead of homosexual relationships would not suffice in your view. Perhaps the state can say its desire to deter the spread of communicable disease or something other of that sort. In other words, if promoting the heterosexual family was not a sufficient justification for enforcing anti-sodomy laws, perhaps the state might instead argue that these laws are of a public health interest." This argument did not find its way into the court's controversial decision upholding the constitutionality of anti-sodomy laws, but nonetheless, Justice O'Connor's query reflects a link between anti-sodomy legislation and HIV criminalization that is woven into history. For example, when Nevada lawmakers moved to decriminalize sodomy in the summer of 1993, some lawmakers expressed concern that repealing the sodomy law would result in a spike in HIV infections. As one local woman colorfully put it during her public testimony before a House committee on the sodomy repeal bill, quote, "Garden variety's practices of homosexuals are a medical horror story. This population of gays and lesbians is a cesspool for disease." This idea gained a great deal of traction, and as a direct response to the state's anti-sodomy law's repeal, lawmakers immediately introduced felony HIV-specific legislation. In states like Nevada and Virginia, anti-gay stigma drove lawmakers to criminalize HIV very explicitly. It was tied up in these sodomy debates. So collectively, these three factors, early, widely publicized failures to use general statutes, on the one hand, organized aggravation among police against sex workers living with HIV, and then finally, third, anti-gay stigma. These three factors provided the impetus for criminalizing HIV. Far from a federal story assorted without basis in numerous law review articles, a careful analysis of the debates reveals a more complex web of factors that ultimately led to the criminalization of HIV. Indeed, as I show in the book, by the time the Presidential Commission issued its report in 1988, recommending criminalization, lawmakers in 16 states had already introduced over 24 bills that would impose some form of criminal sanction against people living with HIV. So rather than the spark that ignited a wave of criminalization, I argue instead that these federal policies played a more diminished institutionalizing role, legitimizing moves towards criminalization that were already well underway. So all right, now we have a sense of where these laws came from. By the middle of the 1990s, most states would go on to enact HIV-specific criminal legislation had done so. So most of these laws are relics of the 80s and early 90s. The result is a patchwork of 30-plus states with misdemeanor or felony laws, mostly felony, regulating the behavior of people living with HIV. But now that the laws are on the books, how are they enforced? In the next section of the talk, I explore how stigma and bias shape the application of HIV exposure and disclosure laws in the US. So in the book, I'm able to go into great detail analyzing 58 convicted cases involving 54 defendants under Michigan's 1988 felony HIV disclosure law, as well as 45 convicted cases involving 42 defendants under Tennessee's 1994 felony HIV exposure law. The bulk of this analysis focuses on the 6,654 pages of court transcripts associated with 194 court proceedings from 78 of those criminal cases. So that's a lot of words. Let me tell you. But as I argue in more detail in the book, courtroom talk is more than just words, and the words used to represent and describe HIV and HIV-positive defendants are far from toothless talk. Lawyers and judges wield stigmatizing rhetoric as a hammer. Ignorant and prejudicial views of HIV serve as justifications for harsh sentences demanded by prosecutors and imposed by judges. At times, the law in the books appears almost as an afterthought, as judges and prosecutors find creative ways to work around or simply ignore sections of the written law that would appear to limit its statutory scope. In invoking such misleading and stigmatizing rhetoric, trial courts codify outdated and inaccurate depictions of HIV into case law, thereby opening the door to more cases, more convictions, more stigmatizing rhetoric. Stigmatizing language is therefore, to speak sociologically, an important moderating variable that shapes the application of HIV law in practice. So I don't have time to talk to you about all these cases today, but I'll instead focus on a handful of cases that I think are representative and that highlight some of the issues here. The first involves the first woman prosecuted in Michigan under their felony statute. Her name was Brenda. She was a 32-year-old white woman living in a small town in western Michigan. Anyone from Michigan here? No, Michigan? Okay. Muskegon County, out west. She had an IQ of 72, which if you know anything about IQs, that's just barely above the threshold of being diagnosed as having a developmental disability. She contracted HIV early in the epidemic, and authorities viewed her as a thorn in their side for years. When they found out she was sexually active in 1992, in fact, they quarantined her. She's one of the only people, in fact, the only person that I know of to ever be quarantined for HIV in the US. Brenda was rebellious, to say the least. She was appointed a legal guardian when she was quarantined because she was deemed not competent to take care of herself. She was placed in an adult foster care home. She eventually grew quite frustrated with that environment and the lack of independence it offered her, and begged to be housed somewhere else, on her own. She wanted independence. Her legal guardian obliged, ultimately, and moved her not to stable housing or an apartment, but to a rundown motel notorious for drug use and prostitution. So, no surprise, within 48 hours, Brenda called back after moving. She begged him, again, this time to let her go back to the foster care home. She told him that she had had sex with a man. She claims that he knew of her HIV positive status because her picture is plastered across newspapers, local, federal, state, all over the country. But her legal guardian called the police, who promptly arrested Brenda on felony charges that she had sex with a man but did not disclose her HIV status. Now, initially, Brenda's motel neighbor did not want to testify in this case. He changed his tune quite quickly, though, after police arrested him on outstanding parking tickets and leveraged that arrest to secure his testimony in exchange for dropping some of the tickets. He did not test positive for HIV, nor, remember, was he likely, given the odds of transmission during a one-time condomless sexual encounter between an HIV-positive woman and an HIV-negative man, or around about 1 in 2,000. Nonetheless, at trial, prosecutors described Brenda as selfish and a potential killer, calling her, quote, a carrier of death. She was found guilty by a jury and sentenced to 32 months in prison. At sentencing, the judge scolded Brenda for, quote, carrying a deadly weapon, or HIV, and going around, quote, killing people. And these kinds of metaphors of violence and death echo throughout the case law for decades to come. It's not unique to this time period. So I find when I talk to people about my research in this book, most people do not imagine Brenda as the typical defendant. They imagine a far scarier figure, usually men, who are out there maliciously trying to infect as many people as possible, someone, jumping out of the shadows. In real life, those boogeymen are few and far between. Most defendants engage in low or no-risk sexual practices. Many used a condom, and still many others had, quote, an undetectable viral load. So the U equals U, undetectable equals untransmittable movement would seem at first glance to undermine this logic of punishing people for not disclosing their HIV status. After all, if you cannot transmit the disease, why, what's the ethical duty to disclose at that point? We don't expect people to disclose they have cancer, for example, or other non-infectious disease. Alas, as I show in Punishing Disease, so far this scientific progress has not translated in American courtrooms. Courts routinely punish people living with HIV, even when there was no plausible risk. And some people in the audience maybe think, well, any risk is too much, right? Any risk is too much. But so to sort of get right to the heart of the matter, let's take the case of Melissa, also in Michigan. A stripper convicted in 2009 under Michigan's felony HIV disclosure law after the club she worked in was raided for drugs. When the police discovered she was HIV positive, they threw the book at her. Michigan law requires disclosure of HIV, as we said, before any sexual penetration, which is defined very broadly as including, quote, any intrusion, however slight, of any part of a person's body or object into another person's genital or anal openings. So when I gave this talk to a group of medical students, one of them asked whether that might include a pelvic exam. And it sounds quite ridiculous, but Melissa's case reveals that to be a sensible concern. Melissa was not accused of having sex with a client. The media reports were extremely vague, however, about exactly what transpired. And when I finally got my hands on the court transcripts from the plea hearing, I understood why. So here's an exchange that actually happened in a Michigan courtroom in 2009. This is the prosecutor questioning the detective on the case who is testifying on behalf of a confidential informant, her client. Prosecutor: let me focus you particularly on a situation involving a penetration with his nose or nasal area of his face. Detective: well, you pay her $20 a song for a lap dance, and on this occasion she was topless. She began dancing, grinding on him, trying to arouse his penis. At one point she exposed her vagina to him and placed it on the tip of his nose and began grinding on his nose with her vagina. Prosecutor: did the confidential informant indicate that his nose actually went inside or penetrated her vaginal area? Detective: yes, it did. So let's all take a moment for that to sort of sink in here, right? I hope that we're all aware that HIV is not transmitted nasally, right? That's not a plausible route of transmission, but that does not matter under Michigan law. All you have to do is show sexual penetration, which can include this scenario, and took place in order to press charges, whether or not that penetration posed a risk. In fact, transmission was rarely alleged in criminal cases reviewed for this project. To be precise, less than 10% of cases involved an allegation of transmission. So cases like Melissa's and countless others across the US are finally beginning to ignite a serious conversation about criminal justice reform for HIV. So I want to just close briefly by highlighting why I believe the criminal law is not an effective or even appropriate tool for managing a social problem like infectious disease. As states around the country consider legislation to expand HIV-specific laws to other diseases such as hepatitis, I think it's especially urgent and important to pause to consider the implications. First, the law often gets it wrong when it comes to public health. As I show in the book, coercion is nothing new in public health history. Emily alluded to that history in the book. Although there are successful examples of coercive practices historically, there is evidence that the state often implements coercive practices in ways that do little to control the spread of a disease. You can all go all the way back, for example, to cordon sanitaire, used as a tool to control the plague in medieval times. These blockades did very little to stop the disease vector, rats, from traveling and spreading the disease into other neighborhoods. In the case of HIV criminalization, the tool promoted by the state for controlling disease is HIV status disclosure, not blockades. But there are good reasons to believe the disclosure is just as shoddy a tool for managing the spread of HIV. More importantly, that many people who are HIV positive, most importantly to this point, that many people who are HIV positive do not yet know that they are infected and believe themselves to be HIV negative. Nationally, the CDC estimates that approximately 15% of all people living with HIV in the US are not aware. They're undiagnosed. And if you don't know you have HIV, you can't go on treatment. And if you're not on treatment, the risk of transmission is much higher. This is a much bigger problem than it may at first seem. Evidence suggests that individuals who are positive and do not know it tend to be account for 54% to 70% of all new sexually transmitted infections. Promoting disclosure implicitly promotes the notion that HIV negative partners are safer. In fact, in many cases, the opposite would be true. In short, if preventing HIV is the goal, there are many goals here, it's not the only one, but if that's a goal, promoting status disclosure is the wrong strategy. Second, the criminal law is subject to abuse. I argue in the book that coercive strategies have often been mired by the ignorance and or prejudice of officials in charge of implementing them. In the 1940s, for example, Seattle's tuberculosis sanatorium became a de facto prison for homeless alcoholics, while the turn-of-century efforts to control an outbreak of the plague in San Francisco led to racist policies under which Chinatown was selectively quarantined. As you've heard today, HIV exposure and disclosure laws were born out of stigmatizing views of HIV that continue to guide the hands of law enforcement and criminal justice officials as they punish people living with HIV today. Blatantly ignorant views of HIV are codified into case law by judges who have no expertise in infectious disease, but nonetheless accept wildly inaccurate claims about HIV as truth. Third, the stakes involved are very high. While quarantine programs generally end, incarceration lasts for years and potentially a lifetime. Thus, the ignorance wielded by law enforcement can have a devastating effect on a person's life. The penalties are steep. As I show in the book, the average prison sentence in these cases is 9 years. Even once an inmate is released from prison, she goes back to a life marred by the label of a felon, facing not just the loss of rights, like voting and social benefits, like food stamps, for example, but also patterned unemployment and a high risk of poverty. Defendants convicted in Louisiana and other states such as Tennessee also face having to publicly register as a sex offender. In Louisiana, that means having the word sex offender printed in all capital letters on their driver's license. And this is Robert Suttle, who's a very powerful and prominent activist who experienced criminalization under Louisiana's law. In short, criminalization can have devastating effects on unconvicted defendants that can be both immediate and long-lasting. Fourth, it's hard to change. Even in cases where lawmakers agree that the criminal justice system is broken and in need of change, actually enacting that change is an uphill battle. Once a criminal law is on the books, it's exceedingly difficult to get it off. The problem is not new. It has a long history, driven by American policymakers and political parties locked in an arms race to be ever tougher on crime. In a context in which repealing a law can make a lawmaker vulnerable for re-election, criminal laws tend to accumulate over time. This quality has led some legal philosophers, for example, to argue that criminalization ought to be a method of last resort. By contrast, epidemiology and medical science can change overnight, as we've seen certainly with the partner study and the undetectable movement. These advances radically change the context for people living with a particular disease. When most state legislatures decided to criminalize HIV, they did so when it was largely untreatable, and for many terminal. By contrast, recent studies estimate, for example, that a 20-year-old gay man diagnosed with HIV today is expected to live an additional 69.3 years. To give you some context, that's several years longer than men who are HIV negative. HIV is not the same disease as it was in 1985, or 2015 for that matter, yet the laws regulating it have scarcely been touched since they were enacted. Finally, the criminal law does not accomplish what we want it to do. Why do we punish? There are several schools of thought on this question. Any criminal law, folks interested in criminal law, I know it's sort of a, okay. So if you study the criminal law, you'll find out that there are several schools of thought as to why we punish. In this book, I explore multiple sort of theories of punishment, but for today, I just want to highlight one pervasive theory, retribution. Retributive theories of punishment argue that we punish, the state punishes, because people who break the law deserve social sanction, because they have committed a moral failing, right, that deserves some kind of response. Indeed, partners pressing charges in these cases often make dramatic claims about the harm they experienced as a result of the defendant's actions. However, given that less than 10% of cases involved an allegation of transmission, that harm was often illusory, and in many cases largely based on ignorant views of HIV. Indeed, the laws are worded in such a way that the crime itself is failing to speak, akin to a crime of omission. The state is not required to prove that the defendants actually inflicted physical harm on any of their partners. Psychological duress, rooted in many cases in an irrational fear of HIV, would seem to be the only measurable harmful outcome in most cases. If psychological duress is the primary harm being punished, then the average prison sentence of 9 years would seem out of step with most just desserts theories of punishment. I want to close by saying that I think we're at a precipitous moment where the future could go one of two directions. On the West Coast, we have states like California and Colorado who have recently moved to repeal their HIV-specific felony laws. These were significant victories for advocates in those states. As I said, it's very difficult to get lawmakers to repeal, period, a criminal statute. They're very concerned, as I said, about being portrayed as soft on crime. So that's one sort of possible future, is that we'll see more states moving to be like California and Colorado. We have another trend happening on the other side of the country, however. In the Midwest and the South, states are moving in a different direction. Instead of repealing their laws, Iowa and Tennessee have in recent years expanded them to include other diseases, hepatitis in Tennessee, and hepatitis, meningitis, tuberculosis, and a long list of other diseases in Iowa. And I think Iowa's case is particularly troubling because HIV and LGBT advocates there celebrated this new law. Why did they celebrate this new law? Because it means for them that they're not singling out or discriminating against HIV anymore. They're punishing everybody. I think that's a very short-sighted victory. I know some of the local advocates, and I get why they felt strongly that it was the best they could accomplish with the legislature at the time. And there was indeed some progress, at least in the most low-risk scenarios in Iowa. The penalties were significantly reduced. But the ultimate result is to further solidify the idea, just the notion that we ought to use the criminal justice system to respond, to manage, to control infectious disease. So what does the future entail? Do we punish more diseases? Do we move towards decriminalization like California and Colorado? I hope for the latter. Based on my years of research and reading, analyzing criminal cases, I can confidently say that I do not feel criminal punishment, and certainly incarceration, for decades was warranted in most cases. What about that boogeyman, right, of our nightmares? I'm not so radical as to say that there's never a situation that might need to involve a criminal justice response. In some cases, I think authorities have a responsibility, in fact, to intervene. That may involve, however, public health interventions before criminal justice charges are filed. But do we really need HIV-specific criminal laws to punish these boogeymen? I would argue no. In those rare cases when you can prove intent, you can charge defendants using general assault or reckless endangerment statutes. When we try to deal with these cases by creating new criminal laws, the result has been ensnaring a much broader group of people and behaviors than I think lawmakers ever anticipated. Disease deserves treatment, not punishment, and our continued attempts to deal with it through the criminal justice system are almost certainly counterproductive, and in many cases, I would argue, downright unethical. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
So we have about 10 minutes left for questions. I'll just get the ball rolling.
Yeah.
So to put it in context internationally, we're the Human Rights Program, so we think about comparative context, international norms. You talked about state-level laws being passed in 1994 to criminalize HIV. In 1994, we had Tunin versus Australia at the UN Human Rights Committee, which ruled against a Tasmanian law that criminalized sodomy, it was really focused on public health arguments. Public health arguments have been really powerful in pushing back on inappropriate criminal regulation of a lot of conduct surrounding sexuality and HIV. Why do these counter arguments not work in the US?
It is interesting. It's not just HIV, right? I think the drug laws and the literature on addiction does not seem to have moved drug policy, criminal justice policy, in a particularly in any direction. And in this case, claims to lawmakers, judges, prosecutors that they had an undetectable viral load, they use a condom, etc., are rebuffed and considered really not part of the question. For them, it's a moral problem. It's all caught up in this moral politics. And I think that's the trouble, is that getting it outside the realm of morality into the realm of science is a feat that, an acrobatic feat that I don't think any advocates and certainly lawyers litigating these cases has been successful in doing. So I hope that changes, but it would be interesting to do a comparative international study to get at what's specifically American here, because there's probably, as you say, I think something happening.
Yeah.
I was wondering what your thoughts were on a situation that occurred in England. I believe there was prosecution where there was a man who went on Grindr, a gay dating app, and sought out partners and intentionally tried to give them HIV. And how you think we deal with admittedly rare situations like this, especially in the context of a place like California, which repealed the law.
So the UK law requires you prove intent, and it requires the transmission have resulted from that, the defendant's action. So it's a different legal context. As I say, I think if you have a case like that, I don't think someone should have necessarily the right to just engage in those behaviors without repercussion. There may be public health interventions that can be attempted first. But if you can show, and in that case, I think there was pretty compelling evidence in the form of text messages where they said, now you've got HIV or something, there was a clear intentionality. I think there are lots of general statutes that could be used in those kinds of cases to hold that person legally accountable. I don't think we need HIV-specific laws to accomplish that goal. Yeah.
So in the states that have moved or are moving towards repealing their criminalizations, have you seen any particular impetus for doing that? What is getting through to those lawmakers that is pushing them towards
that? I think that's a great question. In Iowa, it was one particular case that was a white gay man, a sympathetic sort of person, very sort of normal American looking, who had sex one time, they used a condom, and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. And that resulted in a lot of outrage in LGBT groups, and the general public even. There were newspaper editorials condemning that decision in major newspapers in Iowa. So sometimes I think it really can come down to one case and how that generates public understanding and public sympathy. Is that going to be universally the case? We're not always going to have that case to drive debates, but I think that's unfortunately oftentimes what gets it up to the legislature. In the meantime, there's litigation, right, but so far there's been no successful no law has been overturned on a constitutional basis, but there are efforts to try to do that, so it's possible. Yeah, Grace.
So in this sort of, as LGBTQ politics have shifted in a mainstream way towards a focus on like relationships and love and family and all that sort of narrative, specifically around gay marriage, that's sort of been a big part of sort of validating LGBTQ people generally in the US population. Have you seen the role of sex or HIV related activism? Is it still sort of housed in LGBTQ mainstream politics? Is it drawing on different resources? Sort of how do you see the two relating, I suppose?
I think the LGBT movement, I don't want to say fell in love with the criminal justice system, but their movement around hate crimes legislation certainly created a certain relationship between how they viewed the criminal justice system as a recourse, rightly or wrongly. And so I think they have been slow to come to this issue, and none of the national organizations are interested or concerned about these laws. as of yet. Partially it's HIV, and they don't want to make that link between gay and HIV. They're happy that that's been divorced and is not in public psyche. But partly, yeah, I think is they have an ambivalent relationship to the criminal justice system. There's not a robust critique of the criminal justice system within an LGBT rights framework, at least in the United States. So, yeah, I think the Human Rights Campaign, the NGLTF, they've started putting out feelers on this issue, but they're certainly not leading. It's AIDS activists who are championing this cause so far. Yeah.
Hi, this might be linked to what you were talking about with the Iowa case. Much like choosing a plaintiff for an impact litigation case, I guess you've chosen some profiles for us in the presentation, and I'm wondering if that was to dispel our stereotypes about who some of these criminal cases are brought against. And so you had a woman of a low IQ and then a sex worker, even though you said that sex workers are not generally those who are actually spreading it most. And I'm wondering what the demographic statistics of Michigan cases that you studied are, and how many of them are actually gay men. Other than Robert Suttle, we didn't hear much about that. And how would the argument be different if you're trying to change the minds of a room to think about this for the moral element as well, right? When we're talking about gay men, or especially black gay men, not white gay men, is there a different kind of political valence to that argument?
I think there would be, except the problem then when I come head to head with LGBT activists is the problem, quote unquote, that sometimes advocates say, you know, these laws are being used to target gay men. Sometimes they say black gay men specifically. And what I have found is the opposite, in fact, that it's heterosexuals, particularly white heterosexuals, who are most often being prosecuted under these laws, or most at risk of prosecution. And so there's an inverse relationship between prevalence and conviction rates, and I think by demographic category. And so I talk about that in the book. You know, black gay men, 21% of black gay men in the US are living with HIV. So if you're a black gay man having sex with another black gay man and you find out that they're HIV positive, it is not as earth-shattering of a revelation. The prevalence rates in that community are such that it's a statistical probability at some point. Whereas if you're Linda in Iowa, you're a white woman, right? And the prevalence rates there are like 0.002%. You know, you've never really imagined the possibility of having sex with an HIV positive person. So I argue that it's where HIV is more stigmatized and more perceived as a threat that you see prosecutions happening. And that's been challenging to talk about because it would be politically great if it were gay men, and particularly gay men of color, because I think that would all rally our sympathies towards inequality. But that's, you know, as I show, that's not what's happening. And so I think that's a thorn and a wrench in the side of advocates trying to make arguments to politicians because they can't wrap it in a neat discrimination bow.
But Trevor, in your book, you talk about it being wrapped up in other broader discrimination, like the less likelihood of gay men of color to interact with the police for assistance or to report a case also.
Yeah, right. So they it's not just that they may not see it as a threat, they may not want to call the cops. They may not want to invite the police into their private sexual lives, and that's true for black gay men, but also black Americans generally, that there's probably something happening there. And so that's the future research that I hope happens to try to get that mechanism that I think is driving the demographic trends. It's chapter 6 is that chapter, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Any last questions? Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.